Chuck inside Bryan Kohberger's prison life in May 2026. The reality behind the bars expanded. Nearly a year has passed since Bryan Kohberger entered Idaho Maximum Security Institution. It is now May 2026. Kohberger is 31 years old. He has served approximately 10 months of a sentence with no defined endpoint, no possibility of release, and no legal avenue that leads anywhere except forward into decades of identical confinement. When he walked through the intake process on July 23, 2025, he became one of the most closely observed incarcerated individuals in the state. But what exists behind those observation barriers after nearly a year is something the constant media cycle has largely moved past. The case of the 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, remains significant to everyone whose lives were forever altered by what occurred that night. The investigation remains officially closed, and Kohberger remains in the same cell on the same unit, living the consequence of choices that cannot be undone. If you follow serious investigative cases like this, subscribe right now and hit notifications. This channel examines cases after the headlines move on, after the verdict reaches its finality, after the story should be finished but isn't. We look at the evidence, we follow the facts, and we bring you developments that get buried when media attention shifts. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think about how this case was resolved and whether the legal outcome served justice. Now let's examine what the last 10 months have revealed about what a life sentence actually looks like and what it means for everyone connected to this case. The University of Idaho murders occurred on November 13, 2022, in the early morning hours of a Saturday that transitioned into Sunday. The crime scene was a rental home off campus in Moscow, Idaho, a college town that had not experienced a murder since 2015. 4 young people were found stabbed to death. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. She was a senior majoring in marketing. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. She was a senior majoring in general studies, scheduled to graduate the following month, with a job lined up in Texas that she would never start. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She was a junior majoring in marketing. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. He was a sophomore majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management. He was a triplet, close to his siblings and parents. 2 other roommates survived. They were asleep in different parts of the house. They heard sounds that night, saw a masked figure moving through the darkness, and locked themselves in a room, not understanding what was happening until the following morning. The investigation began immediately. Moscow Police Department led the initial response. Idaho State Police became involved. Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. Nearly 130 law enforcement personnel worked on the case at various points. Tips came in by the thousands. Video surveillance from the area was analyzed. A white or light-colored vehicle, later identified as a Hyundai Elantra, was seen making multiple passes near the residence around the time of the murders. Cell phone data was analyzed. DNA evidence was collected from a tan leather knife sheath found at the crime scene. Investigators pursued forensic genealogy when traditional DNA databases produced no matches. They contacted potential relatives of the genetic profile. The investigation eventually led them to Washington State University, where Bryan Christopher Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology, living less than 8 miles from Moscow. Kohberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022. He was 28 years old at the time. He had graduated from high school in Pennsylvania. He had attended community college. He had earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in criminal justice before pursuing his doctoral studies. His dissertation focused on criminal decision-making. He was studying precisely the kind of behavior that he himself was now accused of having committed. He was also working as a teaching assistant at Washington State University. Faculty members had met with him to discuss concerns about his behavior toward women approximately 2 weeks before his arrest. He was terminated from his teaching assistant position in December. The legal process that followed was lengthy and complex. Preliminary hearings, grand jury proceedings, motions filed by the defense, motions filed by the prosecution, evidence disputes, venue changes. By June 2025, prosecutors announced they were seeking the death penalty. Jury selection was scheduled to begin in August 2025. The trial was expected to last weeks, possibly months. Extensive evidence would be presented. Witnesses would testify. The families would sit in the courtroom day after day processing the details of how their children died. Then, on July 2, 2025, something changed. The defense requested a plea agreement. The prosecution agreed. Kohberger entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. He confirmed separately for each of the 4 people that he had acted willingly, deliberately, and with premeditation. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He waived his right to appeal. He gave up any future legal avenue that might lead to a different outcome. On July 23, 2025, he was transported to Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho. The facility is the only maximum security prison in the state. It is not a place where Idaho sends people who simply need supervision. It is where Idaho sends the people it cannot afford to lose control of. Every corridor is monitored continuously. Every door is operated remotely from a central control station. No incarcerated person ever touches a lock. Furniture is bolted to the floor. The outdoor recreation areas are not yards with grass or trees. They are enclosed concrete spaces open only to a rectangle of sky directly above, surrounded on all sides by fencing and wire. No grass, no horizon, no sense of the world beyond those walls. Kohberger was not placed in general population. He was assigned immediately to J Block, designated long-term restrictive housing. Approximately 30 people occupy that unit at any given time. Every person inside has been assessed by the institution as requiring separation from the broader population. Some have been inside that unit for years. Some arrived knowing they would never leave. Over time, they have reached a state that is not contentment and not peace, but something closer to a complete flattening of expectation. The routine has stopped being something that happens to them. It has become simply what existing feels like. His cell is 6 feet by 9 feet. A mattress, a toilet, a sink, a narrow slot at the base of the door for his meal tray. No view. No separation between where he sleeps and where he uses the bathroom. 23 hours a day inside that space. 1 hour in the concrete outdoor enclosure. Every movement through the facility made in physical restraints. Showers every other day on the institution's schedule, not his. The food arrives through the slot. The lights change on a timer he does not control. The door opens and closes based on decisions made by people he will never meet. When Kohberger arrived in July 2025, observers noted that he was resistant to the institutional structure in ways that other long-term residents had moved past. He filed formal complaints about minor issues, a commissary account that had not been set up yet, ventilation that allowed voices from neighboring cells, cell flooding allegedly caused deliberately by other inmates, meal trays that arrived incomplete, a bag containing personal property that had gone missing. Each complaint was submitted carefully, methodically, using the reasoned argument style that had worked for him inside academic institutions. The system would evaluate his claim. The system would recognize the validity of his concern. The system would correct the problem. That is how institutions work when you are a person with credentials and standing. That is not how institutions work when you are a number inside J Block. The complaints were reviewed. Most were closed without action. The institutional response was that procedures were being followed. New arrivals were processed on standard timelines. Issues would be resolved in due course. The meal tray problem was noted as an accounting discrepancy that would be investigated. The ventilation issue was described as a structural reality of the unit design that could not be modified. The cell flooding was acknowledged but attributed to causes that could not be definitively traced to any individual, so no disciplinary action could be taken. Kohberger's response pattern, filing repeatedly about small things when each previous filing had produced no result, sent a signal throughout J Block that observers interpreted quickly. The pressure was reaching him. The environment was affecting him. He had not yet accepted what every long-term person in that unit had already accepted. that the system was not going to bend toward him, regardless of how clearly or carefully he made his case, that he was still writing to a system as though it owed him a response when it did not, that the people around him could see this resistance and would use it to their advantage. The pressure intensified. Inmates in J Block identified his cell location. They deliberately used the shared ventilation system connecting cells to direct voices and taunts toward his location. Correctional officers confirmed that comments were being directed at him, but stated that because no individual source could be determined, no action could be taken. Inmates deliberately flooded their cells, letting water run until it spread across the tier floor. Not accidental, tactical. In an environment governed entirely by routine, manufacturing disorder is its own form of power. It does not need to reach you physically. It only needs to make the environment feel unstable. By his third week in custody, Kohberger filed a transfer request. He wanted to move to B Block, which he understood to be less restrictive. He framed his request carefully, citing his capacity to function better in a stable setting, arguing that the transfer would serve the institution's interests as much as his own. It was the kind of reasoned, credential-backed argument that had worked for him inside academic institutions his entire adult life. The answer came back the same day, denied. J Block was described as generally calm and well-managed. He was advised to give it time. A housing placement hearing was scheduled for August 12, 2025, 3 weeks into his sentence. What happened inside that hearing room was noted by correctional staff as unexpected. For the first time since his arrest in December 2022, Kohberger demonstrated what witnesses described as genuine self-awareness. Without being prompted, he acknowledged that the pressure from other inmates through the ventilation would likely decrease as public attention on his case faded. He understood that his national profile was a direct factor in making him a target. He stated it clearly, and he was correct. That is precisely how those dynamics work inside long-term restrictive housing. High-profile arrivals draw concentrated attention. As outside coverage fades, so does the incentive. Then came his requests. Solo recreation time not integrated with other inmates. Individual escorts through the facility rather than group movements. Access to structured work assignments when they became available. And then the most analytically interesting request. He asked for the same specific recreation privileges that another named high-profile person already inside J Block was receiving. He had been watching. He had identified who else in that unit held a comparable profile. He had assessed what accommodations that person had been granted. He used a formal hearing to request identical terms. Even in that room before a committee with complete authority over his daily existence, he was doing what he had always done. Analyzing the structure, identifying what was available, positioning himself within the constraints. The committee's decision was to remain in administrative segregation, same unit, same tier, same cell. A spokesperson for the Idaho Department of Correction confirmed afterward that J Block staff maintained a safe and orderly environment for all people in custody. The voices through the vents, the flooding, the sustained pressure, none of it was characterized as a problem requiring a solution, because it is not a malfunction. It is the environment. That is the system he had requested transfer from, and the system that had just determined he would remain in. By August 2025, approximately 1 month into his sentence, something happened that Kohberger had almost certainly never accounted for. Reports began spreading online, largely unverified but widely shared, that short clips of him inside his cell had been secretly recorded and distributed on social media. The Idaho Department of Correction opened an internal investigation immediately. Every staff member was put on formal notice. Unauthorized recording or distribution of footage carried severe disciplinary and potential legal consequences. The footage was never officially confirmed as authentic. No individual was ever publicly identified as responsible. But what that moment represented was significant. Prosecutors had described Kohberger throughout the case as someone who operated with a deliberate awareness of how evidence works. Someone who understood what could be traced and what could not. Someone careful about his exposure within the systems he moved through. That version of him no longer existed. Inside a maximum security cell with a door that opens on someone else's schedule and a slot at its base through which a phone could be pointed at any moment without warning, He had no ability to manage how he was seen. The control he had exercised so carefully outside those walls was simply gone. He eats when the tray arrives. He sleeps when the lights change. He moves along a route chosen by an escort he had no part in selecting. By November 2025, approximately 4 months into his sentence, the documentation indicates a subtle shift. He stopped filing formal complaints about minor issues. The pattern of grievances that had characterized his first weeks simply ceased. His behavior during recreation periods became routine rather than reactive. He began participating in structured activities available within J-Block's limited programming. He accessed the facility's library system, requesting textbooks and academic materials. A man who had spent years studying criminal behavior from the safety of an academic institution was now reading about the same subject matter while living as the subject of study himself. The families of the 4 victims experienced the year differently depending on their circumstances and their position on the guilty plea agreement. The Goncalves family and the Kernodle family never accepted the plea arrangement. They were not consulted before the agreement was proposed. The first they knew of it was a letter informing them that the defense had requested a plea deal weeks before the trial they had been preparing for was scheduled to begin. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, spoke about this publicly. He said the process failed his family, that something was taken from them in November 2022 when his daughter was killed, and something was taken from them again in July 2025 when they learned they would not have the opportunity to hear the prosecution present every detail of evidence, to have the defendant cross-examined about his actions, to have a jury determine guilt through the full presentation of the case. The first knowledge the Goncalves family had that a plea was being negotiated came when they were informed it was done. They were not asked their preference. They were not consulted about whether they would accept a guilty plea without a trial. The institutional process did not include them in a meaningful way. The prosecution represents the state, not the individual families. The state's calculation was sound. A guaranteed permanent sentence. No risk of an unexpected verdict. No decade of appeals where a higher court might overturn the conviction or require a new trial. From an institutional standpoint, the decision made sense. But from the standpoint of a family seeking to understand exactly what happened to their child, exactly how she died, exactly what led the person responsible to make the choices he made, the plea created a permanent gap. The trial would have produced testimony about her final moments. It would have allowed the family to hear the evidence presented systematically. It would have provided a public record of what occurred. The guilty plea bypassed all of that. Kohberger admitted guilt without ever explaining it. The families who wanted that explanation were permanently denied it. The Mogen family and the Chapin family reached a different conclusion. Ben Mogen, Madison's father, stated that he saw the guilty plea agreement as an opportunity to avoid the pain and spectacle of a prolonged trial, that years of appellate proceedings would have extended the grief indefinitely. That closure, however imperfect, was preferable to decades of legal processes. Stacy Chapin, Ethan's mother, said that while their initial response was one of wanting maximum accountability, after extensive discussion with prosecutors, they came to believe the guilty plea represented the best possible outcome. They did not view it as injustice. They viewed it as a way to end the legal ordeal while ensuring he would never be released. Both positions exist simultaneously. The families are not wrong in their different conclusions. What this reveals is something that the legal system was never designed to resolve: the gap between institutional justice and personal justice. One type of justice prioritizes legal certainty and finality. It removes the possibility of appeals. It guarantees a permanent sentence. From an institutional perspective, that is justice served. Another type of justice prioritizes understanding and closure. It asks for explanations. It demands that evidence be presented comprehensively. It seeks to understand not just that something happened, but why it happened. For the families who needed that second type of justice, the guilty plea represented a failure of the system, regardless of the permanence of the sentence. In January 2026, approximately 6 months after Kohberger's incarceration, his sister spoke publicly for the first time since his arrest. She stated that the family had been shocked by his arrest and had no prior knowledge of his involvement in the murders. The family has maintained distance from him since his incarceration. They do not visit. They do not correspond. They do not appear in any official capacity connected to his case. He remains legally connected to them through family relationship, but socially and emotionally severed in a way that extends the isolation beyond the physical confinement. The broader question of motive remains officially unresolved. Judge Stephen Hippler stated at sentencing that Kohberger's motive may never be fully understood, that the truth of what drove him to that house on November 13, 2022, might never be available to the families, to the public, or to the historical record. A guilty plea requires only that a person confirm they committed the act. It does not require them to explain why. It does not require them to express remorse. It does not require them to provide any insight into their reasoning or emotional state or the circumstances that led to the crime. Kohberger has never provided that explanation. In 10 months of confinement, he has not spoken to media. He has not given interviews. He has not attempted to present any version of his narrative to the public or to the families. He has not sought to explain himself in any official capacity. He remains, from a public standpoint, a person who admits to having done something but offers no insight into his reasoning. Some scholars who study criminal cases note that this silence might be intentional, that offering an explanation could invite further scrutiny or criticism, that remaining silent allows people to project their own theories onto the crime. This silence creates a particular kind of historical incompleteness. 4 people are dead. 1 person is in permanent confinement. The why remains inaccessible. Researchers who study decision-making in serious crime have noted that this gap is not unusual. Many perpetrators never provide satisfactory explanations for their actions. Some claim they did not know why. Some cite circumstances that do not logically account for the severity of what occurred. Some cite childhood trauma or mental health conditions. Some simply choose silence. What is available in this case is circumstantial evidence from the investigation. Cell phone data, showing his phone disconnected and reconnected around the time of the murders. Surveillance video of an individual matching his general description near the crime scene. DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene. But the perpetrator himself has provided none of the context that would help families or researchers understand the choice. What has changed in May 2026, nearly 10 months into his sentence, is the institutional reality of serving that sentence. Kohberger is now past the acute phase of adjustment. The acute phase, typically lasting from 3 to 6 months in cases of long-term segregation, involves the greatest immediate distress. The environment feels intensely hostile. The routine feels imposed and unbearable. The separation from everything that constituted a person's previous identity feels fresh and raw. The person has recently lost their freedom, their autonomy, their ability to make decisions about their own daily life. The contrast between what was and what is becomes visceral. By month 10, that rawness has transformed into something different. Not acceptance, but something closer to integration. The routine has stopped being something that happens to him. It has become simply what existing is. Research on long-term confinement is consistent on this point. The environment that initially feels intolerable does not remain so, not because it improves, but because the human brain adapts to whatever conditions it is given. This is not a sign of peace or resolution. It is a neurological response to prolonged constraint. Identity, which is typically maintained through interaction with the external world, through the roles we perform, through feedback and recognition from other people and institutions, begins to flatten when that external world is reduced to a cell, a meal schedule, and an hour of outdoor time in an enclosed concrete area. The person Kohberger understood himself to be, the researcher, the doctoral candidate, the academic, the person with expertise in criminal decision-making, that person has no role to occupy in J Block. There are no students. There are no colleagues. There is no institution confirming his status as anything other than a case number. There is no framework within which the person he understood himself to be can function or be recognized. What exists instead is a person navigating the practical requirements of surviving inside a maximum security facility. Maintaining physical safety, understanding the unwritten rules that govern interaction between incarcerated individuals, finding the smallest available comforts within the constraints, accepting that almost nothing he wants will be granted, so wanting becomes a less productive emotional response. The person who files complaints about missing meal items or ventilation issues is signaling to everyone around them that they still believe the system owes them something, that they still think their concerns matter in the context of an institution. That signal creates vulnerability. The documentation available from the Idaho Department of Correction indicates that Kohberger's behavior has not been problematic in the institutional sense. No disciplinary reports, no incidents of violence, no violations of institutional rules. He remains in segregation not because of misbehavior, but because his high-profile status makes integration into general population impractical. The pressure he experienced in his first months, the voices through shared ventilation, the deliberate cell flooding, the disruption designed to create instability, that pressure has decreased significantly as public attention on his case has faded. As his national profile has diminished, so has the incentive for other inmates to target him. An unexpected reality of serving a high-profile sentence is that the public attention that seemed so intense during the investigation, trial preparation, and sentencing eventually shifts to other cases, other crimes, other people. By May 2026, barely a year after his guilty plea, the intense focus on Bryan Kohberger had moved entirely to other high-profile cases. Amazon Prime released a documentary series about the murders in July 2025, just as he was entering the prison system. That series presented the case to viewers and then concluded. The media cycle had shifted. The families were left to navigate their grief without constant camera attention, and Kohberger was left to navigate his confinement without being the immediate object of fascination. The four victims, Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, none of them had reached their 22nd birthday. None of them would reach any future birthday. Their futures did not include decades of confinement or life sentences or adaptation to long-term segregation. Their futures simply ended at ages 20 and 21. The University of Idaho constructed a memorial garden in their names in 2024. Posthumous degrees were awarded to all four at commencement ceremonies. Scholarships bearing their names fund education. Foundations established in their memory support victim advocacy and university safety initiatives. Madison Mogen had been a senior majoring in marketing. She worked part-time at a local restaurant. She was a member of Pi Beta Phi sorority. Her family described her as someone with a bright future. Her father has focused on supporting the other victims' families and ensuring that the case remains part of the historical record. Kaylee Goncalves had been set to graduate early and move to Texas for a job she had lined up with an IT firm. She had plans. She had a future mapped out. She was a member of Alpha Phi sorority. Her father has become an advocate for victim rights, speaking publicly about how the plea agreement affected his family and calling for changes to how families are consulted in the legal process. Xana Kernodle had been a junior majoring in marketing. She was close to her family. She was a member of Pi Beta Phi sorority and worked at the same restaurant as Madison. Her father stated that the absence of a trial meant the absence of closure they had been seeking. Ethan Chapin had been a sophomore majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management. He was a triplet, close to his siblings and parents. He was a member of Sigma Chi fraternity. His mother spoke about the difficulty of losing a son while watching the legal system process his death. A particular cruelty of cases like this is that the people most affected by what occurred, the families, do not always experience the legal resolution the same way. Justice means different things depending on what a family needed in order to move forward. Some needed a trial with full evidentiary presentation. Some needed legal certainty without years of appellate processes that could span decades. Some needed the person responsible to take accountability through testimony and explanation. Some needed the legal process to close so they could begin grieving without institutional interference. The system produced one outcome. It could not simultaneously produce what everyone needed. The question of whether Kohberger's current confinement is harder than the execution option he avoided remains unanswered and possibly unanswerable. Research on this specific question, whether people would choose permanent confinement or execution if given the choice, suggests that for many people, permanent isolation with no endpoint feels worse than a defined conclusion. The brain struggles with infinity. It struggles with a future that holds no variation, no point of change, no moment that might feel different from today. An execution would be a defined endpoint. A life sentence without parole is indefinite time stretching forward without a finish line. But Kohberger made his choice. He entered the guilty plea. He accepted the sentence. He gave up the right to appeal. Whether that choice reflected fear, calculation, or something else entirely, only he knows. What is not in question is the outcome. He is 31 years old as of May 2026. He is in J Block at Idaho Maximum Security Institution. He will likely be there in that same unit on that same schedule until his body can no longer sustain itself inside those walls. The legal case is finished. No more motions, no more hearings, no more arguments about procedure or evidence. The families have whatever closure the legal system was capable of providing. Some accepted it as the best possible outcome. Some are still processing its inadequacy. The victim advocacy community continues working to improve how cases like this are handled, how families are consulted, how institutional justice can be brought closer to personal justice. And Kohberger remains in his cell, on the same schedule, living the consequence that no news cycle will ever fully capture. Because by May 2026, the story stopped being about him and started being about what the case revealed. It became about the legal system, about victim-family dynamics, about the gap between the verdict a court can deliver and the understanding a family needs, about whether permanent isolation is the appropriate response to what occurred. If you are following this story, share it with someone who cares about understanding what happens after the verdict. Subscribe for the cases that deserve attention beyond the headlines. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about how this case was resolved compared to what the families needed? What do you think justice should have looked like in this situation? This is where real analysis begins. Not with the verdict, but with the conversations about whether that verdict was what justice actually required. This is the verdict room.